Hello and welcome to the second webinar for this year's Sustainable Cities course. In this week, we look into how cities function. Today, we'll listen and interact with Rafael Tuts. Raf is the Director of Programs at UN Habitat based in Nairobi, Kenya, where he is overseeing UN Habitat's overall thematic work and field operations. Earlier, as Coordinator of Urban Planning and Design Branch, focusing on promoting compact, integrated, and connected cities that are inclusive and resilient to climate change. He also served as acting coordinator of the Housing and Slum Upgrading Branch, chief of the Training and Capacity Branch, and manager of the Localizing Agenda 21 program, working on strategic and action in secondary cities in Kenya, Morocco, Vietnam, and Cuba. He led UN Habitat's, including the advocacy for SDG 11 on making. He received the World Vice President Team Award in 2011 for Global Partnership Building on Cities and Climate Change. We will start this webinar by listening to Raf for about 10 minutes. In the meanwhile, please write in your thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box. Over to you, Raf.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I would like to start this afternoon with a quick introduction about my experience in these areas over the past 20 years. As has been said, I've been working on different areas of sustainable cities with UN Habitat. UN Habitat is an international organization. In fact, the organization within the United Nations focusing on cities and human settlements. And through my career, I've touched on different issues of how cities work and how they're functional. I would like to focus on a few of those to just give you a glimpse of the learnings that come across. The first one was when I worked with a program called Localizing Agenda 21. This is a program that was focusing on small intermediate cities in developing countries. In these cities, we developed environmental planning and management systems. And one of the learnings there was that in order to achieve progress towards sustainable urban development, you need to focus at the same time on vision, on action, and on co-production. That means that you can address long-term goals, for instance, trying to make cities more compact, cities more equal, but at the same time, and this is going to take a long time because you need to change the fabric and the fundamentals of the city. But while doing that, you need to also be able to demonstrate very quickly tangible action for the elected officials, for the population, and for different people who are concerned with sustainable urban development. So this combination of vision and action and co-production also, that means bringing in different sectors like private sector, community-based organizations, academia into this realm is essential. And you cannot do this in a sequential way. You need to do that in a parallel way with connections between these different spheres. So the way we worked is that we set off long-term planning programs. That means looking at 30 years ahead, 40 years ahead, how these small towns can take advantage of economic opportunity, of environmental opportunities and challenges and social issues to transform into more sustainable environments. But we could only do that if we had every couple of months, every year, a number of very tangible steps that would go into that direction. So that's how we designed these programs together with different partners, and that's how the program also became successful and was replicated in quite a number of cities all over the world. It's also demonstrated that you can never have just a top-level movement talking about localization of an environmental agenda, you need to demonstrate with bottom-up successes and also failures, and then feedback to this global movement. So this is something that we practice in all our programs. A second learning that I think is very important for this topic is that when you work on urban and territorial planning, it's extremely important to always zoom in and zoom out between different scale levels. That means you can look at large scales of city regions and groupings of cities and systems of cities, which definitely will come up through this course. But you need also to be able to zoom in into very specific spatial context. That means particular towns, particular neighborhoods, and even go to the level of the quality of streets, the quality of public space, the quality of public areas, in order to connect these different scale levels of urban and territorial planning. And we did that when I was heading our work on urban and territorial planning by creating a kind of framework that said that any intervention that UN Habitat would do in terms of planning and design and territorial interventions would have to achieve cities or human settlements that are more compact, that are more integrated and more connected. So for every single interventions, we evaluated it across these criteria. That means more compact in terms of density, more connected in terms of bringing different parts of the urban fabric together, and integrated across sectors and across levels of government. So we would not be satisfied with any plan, any strategy that would not score high on these three criteria. And that helped us to move all our work in a certain direction, a direction that was just not providing planning assistance, but planning assistance with a very value-based meaning and outcome. And this is something that you need to do over a medium term. It doesn't happen overnight, but once you can demonstrate that this works, that this yields results, that you can do that, then I think it's possible to achieve outcomes in large group of planning contexts. And we were able to do that, starting with a small group of less than 20 planners, which is now grown to a group of more than 100 planners based at the headquarters in Nairobi, and of course supported by teams in different cities where we work, and where we can call in international experience to support local processes. What we also saw in that movement is that when we're talking about climate change, which was coming up as a very strong drive in over the last 10 years almost, from 2008, very, very strongly, that when we were promoting this compact, integrated, and connected cities, we were at the same time promoting climate change smart cities. Because the compactness, the integration, and the connectivity would allow us to have an impact on climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, that sectoral interventions would never be able to achieve. So this kind of comprehensive approach, focusing on core values and pushing this through, was very helpful to also not only further our planning agenda, but also our climate change agenda. Maybe the last point I would like to highlight, and this connects very much with the title of the academy, the SDG Academy, and I've been personally involved in the design of SDG 11 on behalf of UN Habitat, and there actually I saw the power of having such global goals and global directions. We spent probably 2 years very systematically, together with a broad group of organizations, including IISD and other organizations in different parts of the world, including Cities Alliance, including different sectoral organizations, to promote the need for a sustainable development goal on cities. Because we were in a situation where there was actually only a goal in the MDGs on slums and another one on water and sanitation. So how could we move from this very narrow approach to a goal on cities? And this was a process that took several years and a very systematic campaign across different parts of society to convince member states, because member states were the ones that were going to adopt these different set of SDGs, that cities can be a transformative force for sustainable urban development or for sustainable development. And then negotiating basically which different targets are important to make this possible. And that led then to the selection of targets such as targets on public space, targets on climate resilience, targets on sprawl, on participatory planning, that had never seen before in any development discourse, in any general development discourse. So I believe this was a major achievement, and we still have another 11 years to go before we are at the end of this period. And we know there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of, some of these targets are very ambitious, but having such a frame is enormously important to be able to steer the thinking and the practice of urban development in a different direction, which is needed to achieve sustainable development. I'll leave it here. We can discuss further through the questions. And yeah, over to you.
Thank you for your introduction, Raf. In this webinar, we will go for a theme-based discussion. The first topic is on SDGs related to your discussion activity. So, Raf, this week on the course, learners were asked, apart from SDG 11, which other SDG is an important leverage point to bring about change in the community or city? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, indeed, SDG 11, which I just discussed, was a milestone, but the principle behind the SDGs is that they should be universal, that they should be holistic, that they are indivisible, that you cannot only focus on one goal without looking at another goal. And this is very clearly demonstrated in SDG 11. For instance, you can look at, there are probably around 30 to 40 other targets that are not part of SDG 11 that are very important for promoting sustainable cities. Let's start with SDG 1, which is on poverty. There is one of the targets which deals with the access, equal access to land and property, which is very essential, which is not part of SDG 11, but part of the SDG on property. So access to land and promoting different types of land tenure to create more security of everyone about their tenure rights is an essential part to support SDG 11 and sustainable cities. Another one is, of course, gender. We know that SDG 11 has a number of targets that are very explicitly important for gender, such as public space, access to public space, access to sustainable mobility, with a specific identification of gender as one of the factors to look at in these access issues. But if you look at, of course, SDG 5, which is totally focused on gender, that gives a lot more additional targets and levers to achieve sustainable cities. And then we have, and these first 5 SDGs are actually the heritage already of the MDGs. This is the continued work, the continued business from before. We look at SDG 6 and 7. These are 2 new SDGs on water and on energy. Very important for sustainable cities, as you all know, with very specific issues about renewables, about integrated water management, which are monitored, and we also play a role in some of these targets, together with many other institutions. So it's, again, you cannot disconnect that from SDG 11. Then moving forward, SDG 8, which is now up for discussion this summer in New York, about decent work, where ILO is leading. Obviously, decent work in cities is essential to creating sustainability. SDG 9 is also important, but maybe SDG 10 is also total new SDG on inequality, which also talks about orderly and safe migration, which again connects very well with the sustainable cities topic. How can migrants be integrated in cities and in a productive way, in a harmonious way, contribute to the overall sustainability? And then moving beyond 11, number 12 is sustainable consumption and production. Again, a large majority of the achievement in that SDG, which relates to changing consumption patterns, changing production patterns, related to waste also, is very much connected to sustainable cities. Climate change, as already mentioned, number 13, again, has a direct connection. And then moving forward towards the governance and the partnership goals are essential. So in a way, you could probably say that apart from the 10 targets in SDG 11, there's another 20, 30 targets that are essential in order to achieve sustainable cities.
We now have questions on the YouTube live chat. Iram Khan wants to know, how do you see the development of sustainable cities in the third world? And there's a similar question from Azmat. He wants to know, what are your recommendations for the sustainability in the third world countries, especially located in Asia?
Well, you see, if you look at, if we're focusing on developing countries, there are some, let's say, some opportunities and some challenges. Let's take one of the opportunities. There's a lot of growth, urban growth, that still has to happen in the world, and it's almost entirely concentrated in developing countries, more specifically in South Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. 95% of the urban growth will happen there. That means there are opportunities for developing urban patterns, urban fabrics, urban development, where in fact, technically, we can do things much better. And we don't have the burden of having to refurbish or re-engineer very heavy past investments that are very costly to re-engineer. So in a way, developing countries have an advantage in the sense that a large part of the built stock in terms of housing and infrastructure still needs to be built. Of course, the second advantage, which is also a disadvantage, is the issue about emissions. Currently, emissions in developing countries are extremely much lower, sometimes a factor 10 times lower per capita than in industrialized nations. But this is changing very quickly, and probably this gap is reducing, because most of the technological advances we see in middle-income countries and in OECD countries, whereas the expansion of services and expansion of energy is happening, obviously, in developed countries of the South. So there we have to really accelerate the speed at which some of the origins of the development of energy and the reduction of emissions are addressed in developing countries. We see lots of progress, but still much more will be needed, and this is part of the, of course, of the Paris Agreement, which is one of the elements of long-term sustainability of the planet. So I would say advantages and disadvantage, very encouraging, very brilliant minds, very excellent examples in many parts of the world, but still too much islands of excellence within a large majority of other cities that are still moving forward business as usual. And that's worrying. If you look at the literature, and you can take almost any country, within these countries, you find sometimes 1, 2, 3 cities that are always coming back in the literature for having done excellent things, developed, adopted excellent plans, demonstrated move towards sustainability, but how to move from these 2 or 3 cities to 20, 30, 50, 100 and more cities, depending on the fabric of the country. That's the big challenge. And to address that cannot happen without an intervention and support from the national level or from the subnational level, depending on the structure of the country. So you cannot expect that this wave of innovation happening in a few cities will automatically spread to a large, and we don't have the time for that. So there needs to be an explicit incentives from subnational and national levels to encourage other cities to take up similar types of innovations, like the ones that have been taken up by the forerunners in these countries. That's a big challenge, and that's something that has to come from the national and from the subnational government.
SDGs be monitored and evaluated to ensure progress towards addressing urban issues. And Juhi wants to know, when we talk of third world countries, SDGs fail miserably in addressing key issues of poverty and housing at grassroots. How to bring about a valid change in such communities?
Okay, on the measurement, yes, one of once the SDGs were agreed in 2015, there was a whole process started about the indicators for the monitoring system. And in fact, that process is not yet completed. It is expected to be completed only next year. So you see, there was a 5-year period, because there's so many new targets that have never been measured, that needed to develop methodologies and so on. For instance, the targets on many targets on health and education, some of them have changed, but others are like a continuation of past work. On slums, for instance, there was already a measurement method, but then there was an additional element added, that one of adequacy and affordability, which brings in a new way of measurement. But some of the targets are totally new. One of them is sprawl. Agreeing how to measure sprawl, which data to use, what is the unit of measurement. These are questions that are still being debated, and we are making good progress, but still not yet completed. Public space is another one where there is an agreement on the target and there's an agreement on how to measure it, but to build up the volume of data in sufficient countries by beginning of next year is very important, because if we don't reach that, then member states might say that these and these targets are not measurable and therefore will not be able to be monitored through 2030. So there's a lot of work going on there, and it's an interesting discussion. It's a discussion between very conservative statistical commissions who have certain standards, certain ways of working, with sometimes very progressive civil society organizations that have other ways of monitoring, of measurement, using geospatial data, using community bottom-up data, using big data to complement the official sources of information. So this is a critical way of how to bring these sources of data together to be able to have credible measurements, instruments, and methodologies to say that in these and these countries, for instance, access to public space for certain groups is improving. So this is what we want to measure. So how do we get there? And the second part of the question about, I think what I'm hearing there is, some groups lagging behind or being left behind in this whole process. Well, I would say that for the first time, the 2030 agenda and the SDGs are designed fundamentally in a way whereby it is about leaving no one behind and leaving no space, no place behind. And this is fundamentally different from the MDGs. MDGs were basically focusing on a certain type of developing countries, not even all developing countries, certainly not the whole of the group of nations. This is a much more balanced package that draws attention to all the countries. And in fact, there is not a single goal that should not appeal to any different country. So now moving to the specifics, obviously it's a very ambitious agenda, and it is about goal setting, moving all international support towards these goals. I believe that now, I have not seen since 2016 any project in UN Habitat that doesn't have, and we have about every year 100 new projects. There is not a single one that does not link its outcomes to a number of sustainable development goals and specific targets. We would not approve any of these projects. Of course, you can never, there's a lot of resources required to make this change happen, but at least all the efforts, I would say 99% of the efforts, at least in the organizations I know, can only happen if they contribute to specific targets. So then still, of course, there is a big gap in finance, in development finance at national level, at local level, at international level. So there is a fundamental gap, but all the efforts that are taken are going in the right direction, I believe.
In line on the forum, could we discuss the trade-offs faced by developing nations to prioritize on certain SDGs, apart from their own pressing developmental issues? And what is the role of UN agencies in supporting national and local governments?
Yeah, well, I would say this prioritization is a false premise, I think, because it's not. Yes, there might be some countries that are more interested in, for instance, in marine resources, or more interested in energy because of the nature of the setup of the country, or the gaps that they are facing. But as I explained in the beginning, working on one goal will automatically create entry points to other goals. Like if you're working on the goal of or the target of public space, to use that example again, you would access to public space will need to have action on gender. So you automatically have an entry point to one other goal. Access to public space will also have an one goal, not to stick to that goal, but to have entry points to other goals which may receive less priority in a certain country. So what is it that the UN can do in this regard? I mean, we can, and what we are doing already. So sometimes it is supporting the capacity of subnational level in developing local Agenda 2030 plans. That means sitting together with local government and developing countries to see how would you address this big challenge in your city. What are the priorities? Where can you make most progress in the next 10 years? So that's one, is the planning side. The other one is the community-based monitoring side. We have a program in Brazil where mobile phone technology allows citizens of all types of neighborhoods in a large number of cities to report back on how they see over the past couple of years in which of these targets they can see progress by their local governments, and then assess these data, monitor these data in an innovative way using mobile phone technology. So these are issues that we concretely support member states with and cities with. Another one is to support them in the annual reporting to the high-level political forum. As you might know, apart from the national reports, gradually there are more cities. So far, mainly big cities are developing voluntary local or city reports, which basically say, this is what we have been doing since 2015 on the whole range of SDGs, and this is what our targets that we have set for the city in the future. So this is the most part of our work is going in this direction, the planning, the action planning, and the monitoring. But of course, we also have very specific programs, and there every agency has their own specialization, where we're focusing on very specific targets, such as solid waste, such as migration, such as access to land, etc. And you know, the list is enormously long, and we have a number of areas. UN Habitat has a number of areas, but other agencies like UN Environment, the whole of their work is also oriented towards a different set of SDGs. And if you take ILO, again, the whole of their work is focused on SDG 9, SDG 8, and a number of other SDGs and specific targets. So the whole UN system is reforming around that. And in fact, all the country programs of the UN, and this is only starting now from last month, there's a new system of joint programming with a strong function of a resident coordinator that is independent and that looks at the whole investment of the United Nations in a specific country, where a new way of development assistance frameworks are going to be launched now, and a new way of assessing, all within the framework of the SDGs, is being rolled out. So actually, from the beginning of this year, 2019, we have a new system in place that looks at SDGs as the only framing modality for United Nations action at the country level. And so whether you are UNICEF focusing on children and water, or you are UNESCO focusing on cultural heritage, you will have to work within that framework, which is basically the government's SDG plan, and then looking at what the UN can contribute to accelerate the implementation of that plan. So that's the way things have been rolled out now.
Europe would like to know, how could SDGs be implemented when dealing with sparsely populated villages in a growing process of depopulation?
Yes, so of course, as we said, the SDGs are universal. There is no preference for an urban approach, an approach in big cities. No, the whole purpose is to leave no one behind. But we know that small villages, especially when agricultural reform is happening, there will be a trend towards migration towards small towns, and these phenomena are going to continue until 2030 and beyond. So we have two ways of addressing this. One is when stimulating productivity in agriculture, you're going to move to kind of accelerate migration. So that means you need to focus specifically on small towns, so to enhance the capacity of these small towns to provide services to surrounding villages. Because of the economies of scale, it is going to be impossible to provide the same level of services in terms of education, in terms of water, in terms of health, at all levels of human settlement. That's just going to be totally financially impossible. So strategically, one needs to look at intermediate levels and different levels of services that will support these small villages to have a similar quality of life, so that they are not left behind in achieving the SDGs. But it would not be a direct approach towards these villages, but probably more towards the next level, that the small towns that become service centers for these villages.
We have another question from the YouTube live chat. Have you ever faced with some challenges in implementation of solutions aimed to SD goals? which related to affordability for people in developed economies.
Yes, we have, I think the bigger challenge in our realm is the one on affordable housing, which is a very serious issue all over the world. But I think what has happened over the past couple of years is that this is becoming extremely pronounced, not only in the large cities like Paris and New York and Shanghai, for instance, but in also a large number of second-tier cities where affordability is becoming very problematic. Where and the way we express that is that the percentage of households that are spending more than 30% of their revenue on housing is increasing. We call that the housing affordability gap, is the gap between this 30%, which is a normative target, which seems to be a reasonable percentage of what a household can spend, and what they effectively spend. So that we call the affordability gap, and that is growing. And it's growing not only in the iconic cities that have very high land values, but it is growing in a large group of cities. There have been very revealing studies about that. And this is something that is not an easy, doesn't have an easy solution. There are different responses to it, but even in fact, some of the cities that are very successful fall into this trap and have not thought through how to address this. We promote diversification of housing models, for instance, mixture of property and tenant models, promoting, for instance, mixing different sizes of apartments in one neighborhood so that you allow different strata of society to live together in the same neighborhoods, but then make the differentiations based on the size of the apartment so that you have inherently mixed income within the same, in fact, within the same buildings. This is an opportunity to allow people to at least live in relatively well accessible neighborhoods, but still be able to afford within their means. We have seen, especially in some countries and some cities, very progressive policies towards that. Cities like Berlin, like New York, and others are making explicit efforts to protect tenants and to also make much more affordable housing, to bring more affordable housing on the market. But in doing so, we want to avoid the mistakes of the past. That means such initiatives should focus on an integrated manner of providing affordable housing, not thinking about affordable housing 30 or 40 miles away from the city center, but trying to do it through infills and through mixing different types of housing in all parts of the city.
On the other end of the spectrum from Laura's question, Iram Khan asks cities where population is increasing rapidly, like Karachi, face severe problems related to housing and sanitation. How can SDGs deal with this issue?
Yes. Water and sanitation, the gap there is still enormous, specifically related to sanitation. I think this is the, water is health, is life, and sanitation is dignity. And I think while there are lots of progress in terms of water access, there is not so much progress already in the MDGs about access to sanitation. And the efforts of or the challenges to provide that in a rapidly growing environment is absolutely fundamental. Now, how to deal with that in rapidly growing cities? I think this is one of the answers. There is to be able to be ahead of planning in advance. That means putting in infrastructure networks in advance. That means the main trunk infrastructure to, if we know that the city is going to grow at 4% for the next 10 years, then we know that a certain volume of basic infrastructure will be required in expansion areas. That there's no, you will not be able to accommodate all this population within the existing fabric. So there the issue is then to build in affordable but also environmentally sustainable water and sanitation systems that are appropriate for this context and for the scale of these neighborhoods and for the density. I think what is important there is that there is a direct correlation between certain systems, certain sanitation and water systems, and the density. Certain systems you use in certain bandwidths of density, and you can no longer use when the density goes up. I think this is something that requires foresight planning, that if you want to have sustainable cities, meaning well-connected cities, dense cities, accessible cities, you need sanitation systems that can meet this target. And that cannot be done afterwards. This has to be planned in advance at a certain density scale. And this is an issue that requires, I think, very forward-looking investment, making serviced land available to private sector actors, to individuals with water and sanitation, in order to prevent backlogs or increasing the backlog in the next generation, which is still, like in Karachi, you're saying, still very rapid growth going on. So I don't see there. I see this much more as an city-wide driven policy to make space for these networks, to create this space, so that once the investment is available and the financing is available, it is quick and easy to put this infrastructure in place. I believe this is going to be, in the long run, the only affordable and sustainable solution. But in the short term, different other solutions, more community-based, more plot-based solutions can be made. But I think in the long run, one needs to be prepared to transfer to much more to a solution that allows the density that is required for sustainability.
We will move on to developmental questions next. We're getting a lot of them from the live chat. Bikramjeet wants to know, for a populous country like India, the settlements are converting to a census towns. Census towns are in a very haphazard condition. How can we make it sustainable? Could you suggest some planning measures from your experience?
I don't know the concept of census towns. I'm not familiar with that concept. So this is perhaps specific for India.
Yes.
That's okay. We'll just move on to the next question.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Aparna wants to know, how do we ensure development of cities and towns in Asia don't have a great ecological and human cost?
Yeah, so I think the first thing there is to focus on the reality, meaning that we know that in South and Southeast Asia, cities will continue to grow, and we know the percentages. These things have been laid out very clearly. We know which cities are going to grow how much. So once you accept this reality, then it's a question of planning, and it's a question of making sure that you use the best possible social, economic, and environmental measures to accompany this growth. So I think this is the essence. It's absolutely first accepting that this growth will happen, then planning for it with in a realistic manner. I've just talked about issues of affordability, issues of technology, and in a realistic manner, not in a naive manner, that such a rapid growth will not be able to be accommodated by small experiments here and there. It will need a decisive, proper planning, and creativity. Yes, not moving. I mean, not following business as usual models of the past, looking forward, but at scale, not necessarily. With the speed of change is so quickly that any solution will have to be developed at scale in an affordable way, in an environmentally sustainable way, and then depending on the sector, different solutions are available. I think there's a lot of good practice in different parts of the world. It's a matter of being open to new technologies, new ways of moving forward to match the reality of expansion in a certain context. So learning from other countries, other cities that have gone through such a rapid growth. They may be the same in Asia, they may be in another continent, trying to extract what are the lessons, how did they do it, how did they finance it, how did they ensure that environmental standards were maintained or even improved. These are critical issues. And there are examples. This is not happening for the first time in history. Cities have grown and shrunk and grown again over history in different parts of the world, sometimes successfully, sometimes totally haphazardly. So there's a lot to learn. And let's not reinvent the wheel, but let's face the reality first. We know that the growth rates, we know the quantity of infrastructure and housing that is required. The question is, what is the best solution and how to finance it?
Tamu would like to know, objectively, how to convince economically powerful local elites to participate substantially in the sustainable development of their territory, especially in developing countries.
Well, I think the issue of safety and stability would be probably the main arguments. If a humanitarian approach does not work, meaning if the approach that a rights-based approach, equal access to housing and land and natural resources, if that is not convincing, then I think the other argument of economic benefit and safety would be the ways to convince these particular groups in society that have power beyond power that can positively or negatively influence the sustainability. I believe that in the long run, much more integrated, much more mixed societies have a better chance of achieving economic prosperity for all. And I believe that that argument can be demonstrated clearly to these groups of society that have currently much more power and much more financial resources than others. So starting with rights, if that doesn't work, moving towards economic arguments and safety, security arguments.
Are good examples to address this issue and ensure upward economic mobility. Is rental housing an option? How can it be regulated?
Yes, I think this is connecting to the previous question on housing affordability. Yes, rental housing should be an option, should always be part of the solution. Again, if you look at countries around the world, the percentage of people living in rental housing can vary extremely significantly, and both countries, there is a balance depending on the context. And we see, for instance, in Western Europe, there's a huge variance of the proportion of households that are owning their own place and the ones that are renting. And the protection of tenants, I think, is the key, that people should not feel unsafe. You know, if becoming an owner is not a realistic option, then the system of tenant protection, rent protection, opportunities for changing depending on the family. You know, one needs to, and I mentioned that slightly earlier in the case of land, we need to look at a continuum of options, not just on black and white, like property or tenancy. No, there are community properties, there are different ways of protecting tenants and leaving that flexibility without having to burden a certain household with an impossible financial burden over a long term. I mean, we see countries where, in fact, the loans for housing are being repaid by the next generation, that it's impossible to repay it within 30, 40 years. So you're kind of, and is this a desirable situation? I mean, where parents are burdening their children for repaying property. So I think such situations are really going overboard, and one needs to totally rethink the issue of property and then look at protection of tenancy in certain situations.
We now have a few environmental questions. Banu would like to know your opinion on reliability of historical emission data, gaps in emission inventories in aviation sector, emissions coming from natural leakages, space exploration, and wars.
If you can.
Okay. This is yeah. Let me focus on the emission gaps and emission inventories specifically. You know, this is you know, there's a climate justice is a concept that has been floated a couple of years ago, and this looks at historic emission patterns. That means it's like you assume that there is an amount of, you're entitled as a society in your history as you develop, that you will need to go through a certain pattern of emissions before you reach a capacity of technology that will allow you to reduce emissions. And I think that is fundamentally a very problematic conception, because it would automatically not allow us to even dream of reaching the targets of the Paris Agreement or keeping the temperature below 2 or below 1.5 degrees. Such an approach would not work, because you would have to first allow more emissions before they can be reduced. So it is more a matter of having direct action in terms of the societies, like we said in the beginning, that are still growing very rapidly and basically leapfrogging certain technologies in order to be able to reduce emissions per capita and per GDP unit from now on, and not waiting until this curve goes up and then for it to come down. I think this is a fundamental issue. It's a political issue, obviously, and there has to be transfer of resources to be able to do that. So rather than allowing developing countries, for instance, to grow emissions before they reduce, there should be the efforts should be put into supporting developing countries in developing technologies that can reduce emissions now. So growing prosperity with reduced emissions rather than first growing emissions. So these are some reflections on the patterns, but as I said, still the divergence of per capita emissions between cities like Houston and cities like Dhaka is just incredible. It's between 2 tons to 20 tons per capita per year. So it's a huge divergence. So there's so many things that should happen and can happen to get this in a much more balanced way.
Final few questions for this webinar. Yogender would like to know, how do sustainable development goals contribute to improve ambient air quality, specifically in dense and populated cities?
Yes, so this is another interesting part of going back to the beginning of this webinar, where we were asking ourselves, how does one SDG connect to another SDG? We know that air quality is a big concern, and it is one of the elements of the SDG 11.5, which is the environmental dimension of cities, which focuses on solid waste and air quality, and it connects directly to the SDG 3 on health, where you have a specific also targets on air quality. So you have a direct connection between these two SDGs. In terms of action, obviously there are very, very severe situations which sometimes have to do with the city, what the city can do, but often also have to do with what is decided much beyond the city, what is decided by those people who decide on investment in power plant technologies and the cleanliness of those technologies and so on. But what I've seen in Europe and elsewhere is that the measurement of this, the advancement of the techniques of measurement, is the biggest opportunity for change. That means making devices visible, where people on every street can measure the air quality a day, the weekend, kind of have a very strong bottom-up measurement system that is also visualized in simple terms through internet-based interfaces, is the absolute way to mobilize people to demand action in this regard. But as I said, part of this action can be done at the city level by regulating vehicles sometimes, or the flow of traffic, etc. But others will not be able to be, will have to happen at a different level because of the sources of pollution. So again, complex matter, but we see very good initiatives related, which start with citizens-based monitoring, demanding for change, and then change is happening. And of course, in cities like Beijing and Delhi, the cost, the economic cost of this air quality is so enormous, and the potential challenges to attracting new investment is so precarious that I think change is going to happen very, very soon.
Scott would like to know if there are any land use and planning boards that have SDGs as a criteria. Could you give examples of cities around the world who analyze developmental projects through this lens?
Through an SDG lens. Yes, I think we getting more and more cities that are kind of modeling, that are using the SDGs as a criteria for planning decisions. It is one of them is Mannheim. It's a city in Germany, and they are using the SDG 11 and other SDGs as the main criteria for their development planning and city investment. So it is a model that is that I think is attractive, because it provides city managers with a dashboard for not only investment but also recurrent expenditure. So I see some movement there, but of course not at the scale that it would be required to make this a kind of universal movement towards SDG implementation. So yes, it exists, but still small examples, nothing significant at this stage.
With this, we will wrap up this webinar. Thank you for tuning in and for your engaging questions. We apologize if we weren't able to go through all the questions. We encourage you to post your questions on the discussion forum to start a dialogue with your peers. You could also write to us at cities@sdgacademy.org for any questions or clarifications. Thank you, Raf. Thank you for your time. We're very grateful you could join us on this webinar today. Thank you again for your participation.
Thank you very much. I think the questions were very good, very profound. And I think this is a very good group of learners, which I think we need to continue working through the whole academy sessions. All the best with this course. Thank you.
Thank you for your participation. We will see you next month for our third webinar. Have a good evening.